Welcome. Before we begin our journey into the past, take a moment to get comfortable. Settle into your blankets, let your breath soften, and allow the world around you to grow a little quieter. If you're enjoying these nightly travels through history, feel free to tap the like button or subscribe so you never miss a new tale. And if you'd like to share, I'd love to know where you're listening from tonight and what time your story begins. It's always peaceful to imagine this little community stretching across time zones, each of us drifting off to the same gentle rhythms of the past. Now, let the weight of the day slip away. Let your shoulders loosen. Let your thoughts slow. Settle in and let us drift backward, far beyond the clang of iron, far before the stirrings of gunpowder, into a world shaped by reed boats, soft river currents, and the quiet insistence of papyrus. In the late days of Egypt's new kingdom, when the great temples of Amun still shimmered beneath the sun, but the old certainty of empire had begun to soften at the edges, there lived a man named Wenamun. He was not a warrior, nor a king, nor someone known for grand proclamations carved in stone. He was, instead, something far more human. A scribe, a diplomat, a man entrusted with errands that kingdoms depended on, but which rarely unfolded the way anyone hoped. Wenamun worked in the temple at Thebes, beneath tall columns painted with lotus blossoms and the fading memories of earlier triumphs. His days were measured in ink strokes and steady breathing, copying letters, preparing rituals, and tending to the quiet administrative tasks that kept a sacred world running. He moved with the soft patience of someone who had spent years listening before speaking, and who understood that sometimes diplomacy meant simply standing still long enough for another person to find their words. Yet even he could not have foreseen how complicated his next assignment would become. It began, as many such journeys do, in a moment of perfect calm. The great barge of Amun, the ceremonial ship used during festivals and sacred processions, needed repairs. Its cedar timbers, brought from far northern lands long ago, had grown weary with age. Egypt did not grow such trees. The Nile Valley offered palms, acacia, and sycamore, but no tall, fragrant trunks suitable for the ribs of a sacred vessel. And so the priests called Wenamun. He was to travel far beyond Egypt's borders, across the wide stretch of the Mediterranean, to the land of Byblos. There, among merchants and shipwrights who lived by the cedar forests of Lebanon, he would acquire new wood for Amun's ship, wood that would keep the god's shrine afloat for another generation. It sounded at first like a straightforward assignment. A formal letter of introduction, some silver, a boat ride north. Negotiations, signatures, polite farewells. Wenamun accepted with a respectful bow, unaware that nearly every one of those steps would unravel in ways both unexpected and quietly exasperating. For the moment, however, the morning in Thebes was peaceful. Sunlight spilled across the temple courts. Scribes murmured to one another as they prepared scrolls. The sound of sandals on smooth stone echoed like soft percussion. Wenamun breathed deeply, savoring the stillness, because stillness has a way of departing just when you need it most. With the official documents in hand and blessings spoken over him, Wenamun walked toward the river. The Nile glimmered like beaten copper beneath the rising sun. A mirror stretched across the land. Boats drifted lazily. The air carried the warm scent of silt, reeds, and the faint tang of incense from the temple behind him. Whatever lay ahead, trade winds, unfamiliar coasts, stubborn rulers, or long negotiations, would unfold in its own patient rhythm. For now, Wenamun simply stepped aboard the vessel that would carry him north. He did not yet know that this journey would one day be written down, preserved on papyrus, and rediscovered thousands of years later. Part travel diary, part diplomatic puzzle, and part tale of a man trying, in his own quiet way, to fulfill a task that kept growing more complicated. He only knew that the river was calm, and that calm beginnings often hide elaborate middles. And so the voyage began. The boat pushed away from the docks at Thebes with a soft sigh, as though even the timbers understood this mission required patience. The crews steadied the sail, letting the northbound breeze guide them along the river. Wenamun stood near the prow, his hands resting on the wooden rail, watching the familiar shoreline ease past. Travel on the Nile had a rhythm unlike any other. Birds skimmed the water in slow arcs. Fishermen called gently to one another across the quiet. Fields of barley leaned toward the river as though listening. Wenamun allowed himself to relax. The water was smooth, the air warm, and the day unhurried. A diplomat could not ask for a more peaceful beginning. But that peace lasted only until lunchtime. Somewhere north of Hermopolis, as the reed banks widened and the current began to pull more insistently, a soft commotion stirred behind Wenamun. The sailors were shifting crates, checking ropes, counting the cargo that had been loaded in Thebes. Wenamun turned, curious. He wasn't responsible for the cargo. He wasn't expecting any. He wasn't even sure what was supposed to be aboard beyond his travel essentials and the temple's official documents. But the murmurs grew into cautious voices, then cautious voices into a long pause. And then, because trouble has a way of arriving politely but firmly, a sailor approached Wenamun with the look of someone delivering news he hoped someone else would deliver. "Honored Wenamun," the man said softly, "there appears to be a discrepancy." A discrepancy. Always a promising word. Wenamun blinked in the sunlight. What sort of discrepancy? The sailor cleared his throat. "The silver, sir. The silver meant for payment in Byblos. It seems that—" A small hesitation. "It is not on the boat." Wenamun took this in slowly, the way one might absorb news of an approaching cloud of locusts. Calmly at first, with the faintest hope that it might not be as bad as it sounded. "It is not," Wenamun repeated, "on the boat." "No, sir." Another silence followed, long enough for a heron to glide past, as though offering its own quiet sympathy. Wenamun closed his eyes briefly. The cedar purchase depended on that silver. The negotiations required it. The rulers of Byblos were famously patient, but not so patient that they would simply give away their prized timber to a foreign envoy who arrived empty-handed. Still, Wenamun was a man trained in diplomacy. He inhaled deeply, exhaled slowly, and nodded. "Very well," he said in a calm tone that impressed even himself. "We will continue north. The silver can be retrieved in port." It was the kind of statement spoken by a man who desperately hoped the silver could indeed be retrieved in port. And so the boat drifted onward. By sunset, they reached the broad northern stretches of the Nile, where the river fanned gently toward the sea. The air tasted of salt. Palms thinned. The sky widened above them like a great blue bowl. Wenamun stood quietly as stars began to gather. He thought about cedar trunks. He thought about missing silver. He thought about the letter of introduction tucked safely within his satchel, and wondered whether introductions held quite the same weight when one arrived with empty hands. But beneath these concerns, the night remained peaceful. The sailors hummed as they tied the boat for the evening. Water lapped softly against the hull. Lantern light flickered across Wenamun's face, warming the edges of his uncertainty. Maybe, he told himself, this was only a small inconvenience, a minor ripple in a largely smooth journey. Surely the rest would unfold with greater ease. Ancient travelers, of course, often reassured themselves this way, and just as often, the sea was already preparing its next surprise. By the time Wenamun reached the mouth of the Nile and set sail along the Mediterranean coast, the world felt different. The river's familiar cradle had fallen behind, replaced by the steady rise and fall of open sea. The boat rocked gently, like a slow breath. The horizon extended in every direction, a calm and endless line. The sailors were comfortable here. They laughed quietly, adjusted the sail, and pointed out distant clouds that hinted at small changes in wind. Wenamun, meanwhile, tried to keep his balance with the dignity of a diplomat who did not want to appear inexperienced at sea. Some journeys begin with confidence. Wenamun's began with careful optimism and a tight grip on the nearest rope. Still, the weather was pleasant, the wind cooperative, and the voyage northward unfolded in a long, soothing rhythm. Days blurred gently together, sunlit waves, quiet meals, evenings spent watching the sky melt into a warm, violet haze. Wenamun even allowed himself to imagine that perhaps the missing silver would be a small matter, a temporary setback, easily corrected. But such optimism lasted only until they reached Dor. Dor was a port city along the coast of Canaan, a place of markets, warehouses, and shipyards, the kind of stop where travelers could rest, take on fresh supplies, or settle small troubles before moving onward. Wenamun stepped ashore, feeling cautiously hopeful. A harbor official met him, nodded politely, and arranged a place for him to stay. The streets were dusty but lively, lined with merchants selling dried fish, woven baskets, oil lamps, and jars of resin that perfumed the air with warm sweetness. For a brief moment, Wenamun felt encouraged. Then the second misfortune arrived. It slipped into the story so quietly that Wenamun did not realize it until evening, the kind of misfortune that begins with a simple, innocent discovery. His money had vanished. The little pouch of trade goods and silver he did carry, the personal portion entrusted to him for small expenses, was gone. Not misplaced, not buried under his belongings. Gone. A soft breeze drifted through his lodging as Wenamun stared at the place where the pouch ought to have been. He checked again and again. Diplomats are trained to remain composed, but there is a particular stillness that overtakes a person when the day's patience has been fully spent. Wenamun breathed deeply, slowly, very slowly. He asked the harbor official for help, explaining the situation with measured words. The official listened with what Wenamun could only describe as an expression of mild sympathy mixed with a hint of administrative reluctance, an expression very common among people who suspect they are about to be given a task they do not want. "Well," the official finally said, "I will speak to the governor, but I cannot promise much. People come and go here. If your silver was taken, it is already far beyond our reach." Wenamun nodded, though inside he felt the first true weight of the mission settling on his shoulders. Still, he followed the man to the governor's house. The governor was polite, but weary. Dor saw its share of troubles, and Wenamun's problem, while unfortunate, was not entirely unique. After listening, The governor sighed softly, as if he wished the matter required less diplomacy and more simple solutions. "I cannot return what is lost," he said gently, "but I will write a letter for you, a document stating that you were robbed in our lands. Show it in Byblos. Perhaps it will aid your negotiations." This was help, certainly, but not the help Wenamun had hoped for. Still, a diplomat takes what he can get. Wenamun bowed respectfully and accepted the letter. It was late when he returned to his lodgings, and the harbour outside had grown still. Lanterns flickered. Waves brushed the shore with the softness of distant breath. The crew prepared to leave at dawn. Wenamun lay awake longer than he expected, listening to the quiet of door, and wondering how many more small misfortunes the journey would contain. He reminded himself that every diplomat, at some point, encounters difficulties. He also reminded himself that cedar wood did not negotiate itself into Egyptian hands. He would simply need to proceed, with patience, composure, and perhaps a slightly firmer grip on his belongings. But as he drifted into sleep, Wenamun had the faintest suspicion that Dor might not be the last place where things strayed from the expected path. And indeed, it was not. The morning light spilled softly across the harbour as Wenamun's vessel left Dor behind. The sea was calm, as if offering an apology for the previous day's annoyances. Small waves shimmered beneath the rising sun, and the coastline curved gently northward, guiding them toward the great port of Byblos. Wenamun stood at the rail, robes fluttering in the breeze. He was composed, as always, but his thoughts were steady and practical. He reviewed his documents. He rehearsed his introduction. He considered how best to explain the absence of silver without sounding like a man who had already fallen victim to the economy of poor luck. Byblos had supplied Egypt with cedar for centuries. The relationship was ancient, respected, and formal. Still, rulers changed, policies changed, and the winds of diplomacy were never quite predictable. As they neared the harbour, Wenamun breathed deeply. Perhaps, he told himself, this was where the journey would finally settle into smoother waters. By midday, the boat eased into a bustling port lined with warehouses, stone quays, and towering stacks of bundled cedar. Wood so fragrant, the air carried its scent halfway across the city. The people of Byblos moved with purpose, carting goods, loading ships, and calling instructions across the noise of trade. Wenamun stepped ashore, straightened his robes, and prepared to present himself. His first challenge appeared almost immediately. The port overseer listened politely to Wenamun's introduction, nodding at the mention of Amun's barge, the Egyptian temples, and the long-standing ties between their lands. Then Wenamun explained why he was here: to meet with the ruler, Zakar Bal, and negotiate for cedar wood. "Ah," the overseer said. "Yes, His Majesty has heard that an embassy from Egypt would be arriving." Encouraging. "But I regret to say," the man continued gently, "that he is not receiving anyone today." Less encouraging. Wenamun blinked. Diplomacy could be unpredictable, but this was his official, sanctioned purpose. "When will His Majesty be receiving visitors?" he asked, keeping his tone soft and respectful. The overseer shrugged with practiced delicacy. "Perhaps tomorrow, perhaps the day after. But he knows you are here. He will send word when he is ready." And with that, Wenamun found himself escorted to a guest house overlooking the sea, a place comfortable enough though modest compared to the Egyptian embassies of earlier centuries. There, he waited. Day 1 passed quietly. Wenamun watched the harbour from his window, noting the rhythm of carts, the laughter of merchants, and the endless creaking of cedar bundles being moved to and from ships. Day 2 followed the same pattern. On day 3, Wenamun asked again when the ruler might receive him. Soon, he was told with a kind but non-committal smile. Day 4 drifted by in peaceful monotony. By day 5, Wenamun began to suspect that the delay was more than simple scheduling. Perhaps the ruler wished to observe him first. Perhaps he was calculating the political situation. Or perhaps he had simply decided that the envoy from Egypt would benefit from a long, quiet period of contemplation. Diplomats learn patience. Wenamun, fortunately, had patience in abundance, just not infinite supply. By the middle of the second week, he finally received a message. Prepare yourself. His Majesty will see you shortly. Wenamun straightened his robe, adjusted his sash, and read the message twice to confirm it did indeed say what he hoped. He stepped out onto the street, where sunlight glimmered off limestone buildings and the scent of cedar drifted like incense in the warm air. Yet even now, shortly, proved an elastic term. He arrived at the palace and was shown to a shaded courtyard where fountains murmured softly. Servants passed by with baskets of herbs and scrolls. Wenamun sat on a low stone bench, waiting with the appearance of serenity that diplomats cultivate for exactly such moments. He waited through the morning. He waited through midday. He waited until the shadows lengthened and stretched across the tiles. By the time Zakarbal finally appeared, Wenamun had become something of a still-life painting in human form. The ruler approached with measured steps, his robes embroidered in deep colors, his bearing dignified but alert. He studied Wenamun with keen, assessing eyes that carried neither hostility nor haste. So, Zakarbal said softly, "You are the envoy of Egypt." Wenamun bowed. "I am." "And you have come for cedar." "Yes, my lord." Zakarbal nodded slowly, as though considering not just the request, but every smaller detail surrounding it. Then he tilted his head slightly. "Where," he asked with gentle curiosity, "is the silver?" Wenamun exhaled a breath that felt both inevitable and deeply human. He began to explain. Wenamun spoke with care. There are many difficult things a diplomat might need to explain on a mission. Why his arrival was delayed, why a negotiation must be reopened, why a shipment has changed in size or value. Explaining why the payment for a sacred international purchase had vanished somewhere between Thebes and the open sea was not among the situations Wenamun had prepared for at the temple. He unfolded the governor's letter from door and offered it with both hands, bowing slightly. "My lord," he said gently, "the silver was taken from me in your southern territories. The governor of Dor confirms the theft." Zakarbal accepted the letter, glanced at the seal, and read it with a quiet concentration. He did not frown. He did not sigh. He did not show irritation. This, Wenamun knew, could mean anything. When he finished, the ruler looked up with a calm expression that carried both curiosity and a hint of dry amusement. "So," he said softly, "you arrive without silver, but with a letter explaining why you have no silver." Wenamun bowed again. Regrettably so, my lord. Zakar considered this, his gaze drifting toward the courtyard fountain, as though weighing not just the request for cedar, but the larger question of responsibility. After a long moment, he stood and paced slowly across the tiles, hands clasped behind his back. "When my ancestors traded with your ancestors," he said, "Egypt sent gold, fine linen, beautiful vessels. You sent ships laden with gifts and returned home with cedar fit for the temples of the gods." He paused, turning to look at Wenamun directly. "And now you bring me a letter." Wenamun nodded. It was, after all, the truth. For a moment, nothing disturbed the quiet but the water trickling from the fountain. Then Zakar spoke again, voice still gentle. "I cannot simply give away what belongs to my kingdom, envoy. Cedar must be cut, shaped, transported. Men must be paid. And you ask me to begin all this without any guarantee." Wenamun bowed once more. Then carefully, he brought forward the one tool that diplomats always carry with them: the history of their nations. "My lord," he said, "Egypt and Byblos have been allies since the days when your ancestors first carved the forest roads. Your cedar has built our ships, supported our temples, and held our sacred shrines. We are bound by a long tradition of trust, a tradition that honors both our gods." Zakar listened, unmoving. Wenamun continued softly, "I do not come asking for charity. I come seeking the continuation of a bond held sacred for centuries. The temple of Amun will repay you. Egypt will repay you. And I, Wenamun, will remain here until the debt is fulfilled." Silence lingered. In diplomacy, silence is often the most delicate stage of the negotiation. The moment where a man stands upon the edge of possibility, unsure whether he is about to step forward or step neatly into a hole someone has forgotten to warn him about. At last, Zakar nodded. But it was the kind of nod that suggested the conversation was now shifting to a new phase rather than nearing resolution. "You speak well," he said, "but before I agree to anything, there is something you should know." He stepped closer, lowering his voice with a thoughtful heaviness. "This land is not what it once was. Egypt is not what it once was. The empires of old have thinned. Trade routes have changed. The world listens less closely to the commands of kings." He studied Wenamun with a quiet, perceptive gaze. "And before I commit my people to cutting cedar for you, I must ask, does Egypt truly stand behind you? Are you sent by a kingdom still strong enough to honor its debts?" Wenamun bowed deeply. "Yes, my lord. Egypt stands. The temple of Amun stands. And I stand in their service." Zakar considered this. Then, at last, he gestured for Wenamun to rise. "Very well," he said gently. "Stay here in Byblos while I consider your request. I will speak to my council. I will seek favorable omens. And I will study this letter." It was not a refusal, nor was it quite an acceptance. It was a ruler's way of saying, "I am thinking, and you may wait while I think." Wenamun bowed once more and returned to his lodging. From his window, he watched the cedar-laden docks, the ships rocking gently, the workers chanting rhythmic calls as they hauled great beams across the shore. The air smelled of resin and salt. The sky above glowed in the late afternoon, gold softening into rose. Wenamun sat quietly, letting the day settle around him. Another step had been taken. A step forward, perhaps. A sideways step, possibly. But a step, nonetheless. And in the life of a diplomat, progress of any size must sometimes be counted as success. Still, Wenamun could not shake the faint feeling that the negotiation had only just begun, and that Zakar Baal's next move might require even more patience. The cedar forests waited, the harbour murmured, and Wenamun, with the polite endurance of a man accustomed to long processes, prepared himself for whatever came next. The next morning in Byblos arrived softly, its light filtering through thin curtains and warming the stone floor of Wenamun's lodging. He stepped outside into the courtyard, listening to the distant calls of merchants setting up their stalls and the creak of carts headed toward the harbour. He had been told to wait. He did not know how long the wait would be. Diplomats understand that time is a tool, sometimes sharpened, sometimes dulled, sometimes used to test a visitor's resolve. Wenamun kept his posture straight, reminding himself that patience was part of the craft. As the hours passed, a small entourage of servants approached. One of them bowed and said, "His Majesty invites you to observe a ceremony. Prepare yourself." Wenamun blinked in mild surprise. Ceremonies were rarely spontaneous, and there were almost never invitations extended to guests whose business remained unresolved. Still he nodded. "I am honored." He followed the attendants through narrow streets toward a large open square near the palace. The morning had deepened into a warm golden hue, and people moved quietly, gathering in respectful rows. The square itself was arranged around a raised platform decorated with carved panels, lions, ships, cedar trees, and intricate patterns that shimmered in sunlight. Temple priests moved gracefully, their robes brushing softly against the stone. Wenamun watched as Zakar Baal appeared, stepping onto the platform with measured elegance. The crowd bowed in unison, then softened into stillness. This was not a ceremony Wenamun knew. It was older, local, a ritual honoring the city's gods, protectors of woodcutters, sailors, and traders, gods who governed the winds, the forests, and the fortunes of people whose livelihoods depended on the sea. Zakar Baal raised his hands. Priests chanted. Flutes sounded their gentle, wavering notes. A bowl of fragrant oil was lit, its smoke drifting upward like a pale blue ribbon. The ruler's expression was thoughtful, almost grave, as though he sought guidance not just for himself, but for the city, the forests, and the future. Wenamun realized, with a quiet breath, that this ceremony was not unrelated to his own mission. Leaders sometimes looked to their gods before taking actions that carried weight. As the ritual ended, Zakar Baal glanced across the crowd and found Wenamun. The look was brief, one heartbeat, maybe two, but the meaning was clear. I am thinking. I am seeking a sign. This concerns you. Wenamun bowed his head in acknowledgement. Later that day, he was summoned again to the palace. This time, he was shown not to the courtyard, but to a quiet upper room where the sea breeze drifted through an open window. The ruler stood there, hands resting lightly on the stone sill. For many days, Zakar Bal began softly. I have wondered why you came to me at this moment. Why Egypt sends an envoy now, when the world is shifting. Why the cedar for Amun has become urgent once more. Wenamun kept his posture humble. It is the will of the temple, my lord. The sacred barge requires renewal. That is the practical reason, the ruler said with a near smile. But I am not asking for the reason on papyrus. I am asking whether there is meaning beneath the meaning. This, Wenamun had to admit, was not a question covered in diplomatic training. He answered with gentle honesty. Perhaps, my lord, the meaning is simply that bonds must be renewed, even in uncertain times. Zakar Bal breathed out slowly, almost thoughtfully. This morning, during the ceremony, I looked for omens. I asked the gods whether we should proceed with your request, whether Egypt's envoy should be received favorably. Wenamun waited, feeling the air shift around them like a tide preparing to turn. The signs, the ruler continued, were favorable. Wenamun bowed deeply, relief settling into his shoulders like a warm cloth. Yet Zakar Bal lifted a finger, halting him from speaking too quickly. However, diplomats never love that word. Favor is not a substitute for necessity. My people must be paid. The cedar is valuable, and though the gods may approve, the ledger does not balance itself. Wenamun nodded, bracing himself for the inevitable complication. You will stay here, the ruler said, until the payment arrives from Egypt. When your silver comes, the cedar will be cut, loaded, and sent with you. Until then, you will remain my guest. It was a gracious command, delivered softly, but it was also very clear. Wenamun would not be leaving Byblos anytime soon. Still, it was progress. Real progress. The negotiations had shifted, not dramatically, but in that subtle way rulers often favor. A small tilt of the scales, a slight easing of the boundary between uncertainty and agreement. Wenamun bowed. I thank you, my lord. Zakar Bal inclined his head. Do not thank me yet. The sea is calm today. Tomorrow, who can say? But for now, we will proceed as the gods allow. Wenamun returned to his lodging feeling both relieved and tethered. He had achieved agreement, of a sort, but now he faced a new chapter in his misadventure, the long wait for payment that might take weeks or months, or possibly much longer, depending on the Nile's currents and the reliability of messengers. Yet even this uncertainty was softened by the quiet of the evening. The harbour glowed in the fading light. Waves brushed the shore with a soothing rhythm. Workers' voices drifted through the dusk like distant murmurs. Wenamun sat by the window, letting the calm settle around him. Progress, however small, is still progress. And for a diplomat travelling far from home, that was enough. For now. Days in Byblos began to settle into a pattern. Wenamun woke each morning to the peaceful sounds of harbour life. Fishermen arranging their nets, merchants opening their stalls, the soft thud of cedar bundles being shifted along the docks. He spent his time quietly, walking the edges of the market, listening for news from the south, and waiting, always waiting, for word that Egypt's payment had arrived. Those in the palace treated him with polite formality. Servants bowed, scribes nodded respectfully, and the ruler acknowledged him whenever their paths crossed. Yet beneath the calm surface, Wenamun felt a current shifting. It began with small observations. A tense look between merchants. A guard posted at a place that had required none before. Whispers of ships sighted near the horizon. Byblos was a port of ancient trade, but also a place where sea peoples had come and gone in waves, some peaceful, some troublesome. Among them were the Cheka, a group with a reputation for unpredictable alliances and sudden confrontations. One evening, just as the sky softened into the lavender hues of dusk, Wenamun sat near the window of his lodging, listening to the harbour winds. A knock sounded at the door. A local servant bowed and said, "Envoy Wenamun, His Majesty advises you to stay indoors tonight. Visitors have arrived, uninvited." Wenamun blinked. Visitors? The servant hesitated, then spoke quietly. Cheka, a small ship. They anchor near the outer harbour. Wenamun thanked him and closed the door gently. The Cheka. He had heard stories, some exaggerated, some not, about their unpredictable presence along the coast. Still, Wenamun was a diplomat. Diplomats do not seek trouble. They acknowledge it politely, step aside, and hope it hurries along without lingering. Night deepened. A breeze brought the scent of cedar resin and distant smoke. Wenamun rested on a low stool, listening to the muffled sounds of the harbour growing quiet. But then, footsteps, raised voices, a sound like wooden hulls bumping at the docks. Moments later, more footsteps, closer, voices outside his window, and then, surprisingly gently, another knock at the door. Wenamun opened it cautiously. Standing outside was a man with sharp eyes and a weathered face, wrapped in garments fit for long sea travel. Behind him stood several others, silent as anchored shadows. "I am Beda," the man said softly, "a leader among the Cheka." Wenamun nodded. "Peace to you." The man inclined his head. "Peace, if peace is possible. You are the Egyptian envoy?" Wenamun confirmed it with a calm breath. Diplomacy teaches one important lesson. Never look surprised, even when you very much are. Beda stepped forward slightly, his tone still low and even. "We heard of your arrival, and of your situation." Wenamun felt an internal sigh forming. Word travelled quickly along the coast. "You seek cedar," Beda continued. "But I ask myself, why does Egypt send a man without silver? Are things so changed in the lands of the Nile?" It was, Wenamun noted, a politely phrased question with a very impolite implication. He bowed lightly. "Events beyond my control have caused complications, but my mission stands. Egypt will honor its obligations." Beda watched him for a long moment, eyes narrowing, not in hostility, but in calculation. Then he smiled faintly. "That may be so," he said, But until your silver arrives, your presence concerns us. Trade is tense. Alliances shift. The sea peoples and the coastal cities. We watch each other closely. A foreign envoy with unresolved business draws attention. Wenamun understood. Beda was warning him, gently but unmistakably. Before Wenamun could reply, the ruler's guards appeared at the end of the walkway. Their presence was firm but calm, as if they had anticipated this meeting and meant only to escort it to a peaceful conclusion. Beda stepped back. "I do not seek conflict," he said quietly. "But remember, the sea is watching, and the sea has a long memory." With that, he and his men walked away, disappearing into the near darkness of the harbor. The guards bowed to Wenamun and escorted him back inside. When the door closed once more, Wenamun breathed the slow, steady breath. No weapons had been drawn, no threats shouted. But the message was unmistakable. His lingering in Byblos carried political weight far beyond cedar shipments. The next morning, the ruler summoned Wenamun again. Zakar Baal stood near the window of the palace chamber, gazing out over the cedar stacks and the calm sea beyond. "You received visitors last night," he said quietly. Wenamun bowed. "I did, my lord." "Their presence is a reminder," the ruler continued, "that we are not the only ones who watch and wait. You may remain here as my guest, but we must be cautious. The arrival of an Egyptian envoy raises questions." Then Zakar Baal's tone softened, though it held the weight of responsibility. "You must understand, Wenamun. The world along this coast is not simple." Wenamun bowed again, understanding more than ever that his mission reached far beyond cedar and silver. He was now a piece on a board whose size he did not yet know. Yet even this worry settled into a kind of gentle acceptance. For a diplomat, uncertainty is not an enemy, merely a companion who walks beside you without asking permission. Outside, the sea shimmered under the rising sun. Wenamun exhaled, letting the calm air steady him. The journey had become something larger than he expected, and it was not over yet. In the days that followed the Jekka's quiet visit, Wenamun kept a low profile. He walked with calm intention, spoke only when needed, and allowed the rhythms of Byblos to guide him through each morning and evening. There was little else to do. Diplomacy, after all, often requires more waiting than speaking. The ruler's attitude toward Wenamun shifted subtly, less distant, more invested. Perhaps the ceremony had offered reassurance. Perhaps the encounter with the Cheka had reminded him that Egypt's envoy stood at a delicate crossroads in a complicated landscape. Whatever the reason, Zakar Baal summoned him more frequently now. One morning, Wenamun was brought once again to the palace, where the ruler stood beside a carved cedar pillar, tracing one of its swirling patterns with careful fingers. "You have waited with patience," Zakar Baal said softly, not turning yet. "A rare quality." Wenamun bowed. "It is my duty, my lord." "And a difficult one," the ruler added with the ghost of a smile. He finally faced Wenamun. "I have decided," he said, voice low but steady. "I will prepare the cedar for the temple of Amun. My workers will cut the trees. My carpenters will load the beams. And when your silver arrives, the debt will be sealed in good faith between our lands." Wenamun exhaled a breath he had been holding for many days. This was the agreement he had hoped for, hard won, circled around, delayed, but now finally reached. He bowed deeply, gratitude softening his shoulders. "Your generosity honors Egypt," he said. Zakar Baal nodded, as though concluding a private debate. "Go now. Rest. My servants will bring you news when the preparations begin." Wenamun left the palace, feeling lighter than he had since before dawn. The scent of cedar drifted on the wind, resinous and warm. Workers' chants echoed from the distant forest roads. For the first time since the journey began, he allowed himself the quiet belief that the mission might actually reach completion. Days passed peacefully. Then one morning he heard the rhythmic sound of axes in the hills beyond the city. Another day, he saw men hauling immense logs toward the harbor, their steps steady and practiced. Soon the beams were arranged neatly on the docks, straight, smooth, tall timbers fit for a sacred ship. Wenamun walked among them, trailing his hand along the fragrant wood. The cedar was magnificent, strong, straight-grained, the kind of timber that held temples together for generations. For a moment, Wenamun imagined the barge of Amun renewed and gleaming on the Nile, bearing offerings and priests along the river during festivals. He imagined the temple scribes admiring the craftsmanship. He imagined completing his task at last. But the story of Wenamun seldom allowed a moment to remain uncomplicated. One afternoon, as he rested in his lodging, Zakar Baal's servants arrived with urgent expressions. "The ruler wishes to see you at once." Wenamun followed, calm but alert. Zakar Baal stood once more at the palace window, hands clasped behind him, eyes fixed on the harbor. A faint breeze stirred the edges of his robe. "Wenamun," he said, "a ship has arrived from Egypt." Relief warmed Wenamun's chest. "Then, my lord, the silver—" Zakar Baal held up a gentle hand. "The ship brings news, not silver." Wenamun waited. Diplomats learn to let silence prepare the ground for difficult words. "The situation in Egypt is complicated," the ruler said. "The government is strained. Their messenger reports disputes over tribute, over leadership, over the authority of temples. The silver for your purchase is not yet dispatched." Wenamun absorbed this with a slow, controlled breath. Zakar Baal looked at him carefully. "The cedar is cut. It is ready. But I cannot send it with you until the payment arrives. My council insists upon this." Wenamun bowed his head. He did not argue. He did not plead. He simply accepted the reality, because sometimes diplomacy is nothing more than learning to walk on a shifting floor while keeping your posture steady. The ruler continued, "However, I will not keep you here waiting indefinitely. There is another matter that requires your return home. A ship departs soon for Alashia, what you call Cyprus. It will carry you there, where you may find passage onward." The news was unexpected, unsettling, but Wenamun recognized the subtle truth beneath it. Zakar Baal was helping him leave gracefully, without implying failure. Wenamun bowed deeply. "Your kindness is remembered." Zakar Baal nodded in quiet agreement. "Go with the blessing of our gods, and may the winds favor you." Wenamun stepped outside, breathing the cool salt air. The cedar timbers lay neatly on the docks behind him. His mission remained incomplete. Yet he had not failed. He had negotiated. He had waited. He had secured agreement in principle, more than many envoys could claim. The next morning, Wenamun boarded the ship bound for Al-Ashir. The hull creaked softly beneath his feet. The sea shimmered beneath the rising sun. Byblos receded slowly behind him, its cedar-scented shores fading into the warm haze of distance. The voyage ahead would bring its own trials, but for the moment, Wenamun stood at the rail with quiet dignity, letting the wind brush against his face. His mission was not yet complete, but it was moving, slowly, cautiously, toward its final chapter. The ship that carried Wenamun north left the harbour of Byblos with slow, deliberate grace. Its sail unfurled like a pale wing. Its crew moved with practiced ease. The cedar-scented coastline grew softer behind them, shrinking beneath the morning light until it became only a faint line along the horizon. For the first time since departing Egypt, Wenamun stood on a vessel with no negotiations waiting at the next harbour, no ruler expecting him, no letters to present or retrieve. He was a passenger now, nothing more, nothing less. The sea was calm, its surface moving like polished bronze beneath the shifting sky. Wind whispered through the sail. Salt gathered lightly on Wenamun's skin. During the days at sea, Wenamun found himself drifting between thought and stillness. He stood often at the rail, watching sunlight scatter across the water. He listened to the low murmur of sailors exchanging quiet stories. Sometimes he simply closed his eyes, letting the motion of the ship steady his breathing. There was a kind of peace in knowing the next steps were not in his hands. Diplomacy had its place, but so did surrender. The gentle kind that came from accepting that a journey had taken on a shape of its own. Yet even here, far from Byblos, fortune remained unpredictable. On the third day, the lookout pointed toward a distant shape in the west. A small vessel, fast, narrow-hulled, riding the wind with sharp precision. Wenamun approached the captain, who watched the vessel with narrowed eyes. "It may be a trader," the captain murmured, "or it may be someone seeking information." Wenamun nodded. He did not ask which possibility they feared more. But the distant ship changed course at the last moment, angling away rather than toward them. The crew relaxed. The sea resumed its quiet rhythm. Sometimes, Wenamun realized, uncertainty is simply the mind filling silence with possibility. By the following evening, the mountains of Al-Ashir appeared, first as shadows, then as soft blue forms rising from the sea. The coastline curved gently, dotted with small harbours and quiet villages where smoke curled upward from evening fires. Wenamun felt a cautious hope. From Al-Ashir, he could secure passage home. Perhaps a ship bound for Egypt. Perhaps a caravan leading to a broader route southward. The ship entered the harbour slowly, gliding past anchored vessels and clusters of fishermen tending their nets. The air smelled of pine, seaweed, and warm stone cooling after the day's sun. Wenamun stepped ashore and presented himself to local officials, carrying the dignity of a man who had travelled far and endured much. He introduced himself softly, explained his mission, and offered the documents that proved his purpose. But here, at the edge of the known world, Wenamun's luck wavered again. The local ruler's attendants listened politely, yet something in their expressions shifted. A hesitation, a quiet unease. "You are welcome here," the lead attendant said, "but the ruler is cautious. There have been conflicts along the coast. Strangers are questioned closely now. Wenamun nodded. He understood. The world was changing. Borders growing thinner in places, sharper in others. He was given lodging in a modest guest house overlooking the sea. From the window, he could see the faint outline of Byblos far to the east, just a suggestion of coastline slipping beneath the dusk. That night, as Wenamun rested, a soft knock sounded at his door. A messenger bowed deeply. "My lord wishes to speak with you," he said. "At once." Wenamun followed him through quiet streets lit only by starlight and the glow of small clay lamps. The palace stood ahead, a structure of smooth-cut stone with terraces that faced the open sea. Inside, the ruler of Al-Shia waited, calm, solemn, dignified. The conversation that followed was brief but pointed. The ruler questioned Wenamun's identity, the nature of his mission, the political tensions on the coast, and the shifting alliances of nations. His voice remained soft, but his concern was unmistakable. Wenamun answered with honesty and steady calm, explaining his role, his purpose, and his need for passage. The ruler listened, then nodded slowly, thoughtfully. That is where the papyrus ends. No closing line, no final farewell. No description of Wenamun's return journey or the resolution of his mission. Just a fragment of dialogue, a moment suspended, and the ancient fibers of the scroll frayed beyond repair. The rest, whatever came next, is lost to time. And so Wenamun's tale ends in mid-stride. No triumphant return to Egypt, no final negotiation, no carved inscription boasting of success. Just a diplomat standing before a foreign ruler, answering quiet questions beneath the lamplight, and the papyrus breaking off like a shoreline where the tide has washed away the rest of the sand. For some stories, this might feel unsatisfying. But in the world of ancient history, it is part of the gentle truth we inherit, that most lives were never wrapped neatly into endings. Most journeys faded into silence. Most voices we hear today speak only in fragments, carried forward by chance, by preservation, by the slow patience of archaeologists brushing dust from a forgotten page. Wenamun was not a king, not a conqueror, not a figure whose deeds reshaped the world. He was a man sent on a task, important, yes, but not glorious. A man who navigated uncertainty with calm resolve. A man who endured delays, losses, misunderstandings, and the quiet frustrations that anyone on a long journey will recognize. And perhaps that is why his story feels so human. We do not know if he ever returned home. We do not know if the cedar reached Egypt that year or the next. We do not know whether he felt pride or weariness, or something gentler still as he faced the end of his travels. But we know this: Wenamun tried. He negotiated. He waited. He adapted. He carried himself with the soft dignity of someone who understood that progress can be measured in patience as much as achievement. There is comfort in that. A reminder that life is made not only of clear beginnings and tidy endings, but of the spaces in between, the unresolved moments, the unanswered questions, the places where certainty thins and something quieter settles in its place. Tonight, as you rest, you can let Wenamun's unfinished journey keep you company. His story ends in a calm, open place, a harbor beneath starlight, a conversation paused, a diplomat waiting for whatever tomorrow decides to become. And maybe that is enough. For some stories, the gentlest ending is the one that leaves room for wonder. Let the sea wind soften. Let the waves slow their rhythm. Let the fragment of Wenamun's tale drift quietly into the dark, like a lantern carried on still water. You may close your eyes now. The rest of the journey is yours to imagine, and sleep will come as softly as the tide.